Morning, everybody. We've got some gospel blues going this morning here. We're talking about a pretty hard to come by record on Vanguard, Brother John Sellers. And he's playing traditional kind of black blues and black folk songs. But he's backed by the great Walter Page, who played with Basie and that great, Hot Lips or Page and that incredible group from back in the early 30s. It was an incredible band. Joe Jones is playing the drums here. Freddie Green's on the guitar. See that Basie kind of alumni there with Charles Thompson, Sir Charles Thompson, on the piano. And just the transition for a jazz player into playing the blues is pretty effortless. It's a language they all speak fluently. I got some in my eye yesterday and fucked with it. Now it's kind of swollen. I'm all right. Just that's all that's going on there. Pretty rare piece. I'm nearing the completion of the Vanguard 10-inch series. Another one of those great transitional labels that kind of slips under the radar. Some great talent, some great titles. And it's just really cool seeing the timeline and chronology of all these labels, because you can see the changes in jazz happening through each label. And the difference between the early Vanguard titles, which have more of a Dixie New Orleans feel, and the stuff that comes at the very end of that sequence, it's modern, it's post-bop, there's a big, and you see it on a lot of these labels in the 50s, it's just reflecting all these very quick changes in the music. This was Vanguard number 8005, so that's a pretty early Vanguard title. Here's a Sir Charles Thompson record. And I love the Vanguard label. It's a really gorgeous 10-inch. Where they use that lovely colors. The colors are Bethlehem-like almost. Just a beautiful piece. This has Coleman Hawkins on it, along with other players. Sir Charles Thompson. And Thompson plays with Parker even early on. Emmett Berry's on the trumpet, the fantastic player from the swing era. Benny Morton on the trombone. Earl Warren, Steve Jordan, O.C. Johnson, and Aaron Bell. So again, these early Vanguard 10 inches are really actually great stuff. And you can find them for a decent price. And the label kind of transitions into rock and roll once it gets into the 60s. If I remember, Country Joe and the Fish were on Vanguard, if I remember. I know there's other rock and roll stuff from that era. And so their jazz sequence isn't huge. And I think it's all just transitions kind of. But the stuff that is on Vanguard, from Jimmy Rushing to the great trumpet player. I can't think of his name right now. One second. The great trumpet player Dave Burns. I sat here for about 10 seconds trying to think of his name. And when I thought of it, that doesn't sound right. I had to go look. Dave Burns. He's on some great Blue Note titles as a sideman. He's a great player who's very kind of underappreciated. Bill English, the drummer, has a record on Vanguard that's also noteworthy. Jimmy Rushing has some titles. It's great post-bop into modernism stuff. The Nat Pierce record, the 10-inch, great cover by Burt Goldblatt. It's really cool stuff that really kind of slips under the radar. Next piece I want to show you is something I got from a guy on Discogs. I only paid $5 for it, I think. And it looks beautiful, to be honest. The strolling Mr. Eldridge, Roy Eldridge. And Roy is truly one of the great talents on the trumpet. He's a very transitional figure. He's the opposite of Sweets Edison. He's not going to be always melancholic and sweet. He's much more explosive. And he's a bridge between Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie. And not everyone loves Roy Eldridge. I guess he was a difficult personality. Small guy, but fiery from my understanding. He does a lot of work with Norman Granz at Clef. And he's part of some of the Jazz of the Philharmonic stuff. And again, just a legacy guy. And he should be on any list of the greatest trumpet players of all time. He's got all kinds of vivacity and just incredible personality. Reminds me of time of Sidney Bechet a little bit with his brashness and his confidence. Like just explosive. And he has a lot of dexterity and a lot of modal improvisation. He's just clever with his phrasing. Often he's frenetic even for that era. I mean, he's on the edges and pushing the boundaries. And if you like players like Lee Morgan, and if you respect Dizzy Gillespie, Roy Eldridge is not going to be that foreign to you. His settings are mostly pretty modern and small group. And Lil Jazz. I mean, you got to love Roy Eldridge. I do. I mean, I find him to be a very provocative figure and one that creates conversation. Ray Brown, is on this. Oscar Peterson and Herb Ellis, which is one of the lineups of the great Oscar Peterson trio at that point. And they were backing up just about everything that Norman Granz was doing at Clef, which becomes Verve so shortly. Again, number C162, Clef. They're towards the end, it's about halfway through the 10-inch series. I think it goes to about 100, 200, and I think it starts at 100 and goes to like 215 or 230 in there somewhere. So there's quite a few 10 inches actually at Clef. And a lot of that stuff gets coupled onto LPs in the early Verve 8100s, late 8000 sequence. And so there's a lot of duality in the Verve, Clef, Norgran catalog. And some of this stuff, even from the early Clef series, gets reissued on Clef LP. So it's a second version of it. And then it gets reissued with a different cover and title often as a Verve LP. So it's very confusing. And sometimes you have to spend some time cross-referencing Discogs in your collection, and you're just trying to figure out what's this and what's that. And, the more I get of this stuff, the more I see what it all is. But it's still an immense body of work. I'm well over 600 Verve, Clef, Norgran titles now, and there's probably still 200-300 out there. So it's pretty impressive. Should I take a phone call there for the cafe? We're not quite open yet, but we're seeing a few people trying to get in. We've had a really good week. The week before, we had some bills pile up and a couple things that surprised us. I had a air conditioning / heat unit put in for this room because that's what the building inspector wanted me to do, and there was a back order on it. It took months for it to get here. Thankfully, it allowed me to open up 2 months before it got here. It got here in late December. It was installed early to mid-January, and then the plumbers and the HVAC people who put it in didn't wire it up. I couldn't plug it in. It had one of those fancy plugs like that you need a special socket for. And I'm like, well, you guys, it took you 2 months. It's supposed to be in September. Came in December. You put it in January, and now you don't even wire it up or plug it in. He's like, yeah, we don't do the wiring. And my first time being the general contractor for a project of this nature, I didn't realize that someone was going to install a piece and not make it functional. And so I had to pay an electrician to come back out here and run a wire, put a socket in. It cost me $500. Then we had a pipe freeze, and it's Minnesota, and me not being upstairs as much as I usually am means that toilet wasn't getting flushed, and it just meant that one of the pipes in that wall froze. That cost me $600. And then on top of that, there was a coffee bill that my salesman had forgotten to run through. That was another $400. All of a sudden, I got $1,500 coming out of my pocket last week that pretty much wiped out everything we made last week. And but this week we had a good week. It's like the Cosmos said, okay, we got you. And we did above average sales almost every day of the week. It's hopefully today will be a good day as well. I had a great time sharing jazz and music with people. Jazz is the foundation, but we sprinkle a lot of other stuff in, and I'm always kind of cognizant of who's in the room and what are they going to respond to. What would they love to hear? What's going to tickle their memory and jog their memory banks? And I think that's part of being good at what you do is connecting. Reaching out and finding that similar common ground. Oh man, my eyes just bugging me. So yeah, it's been a really good last week, and today should be fun as well. Yesterday during the Waffle Bar DJ brunch, we had a good crowd near. We had a great crowd near almost every day of the week. My mom came out last week for the first time, so it's been a lot of fun. A couple of the pieces I wanted to show you here. I got a couple of contemporary 10 inches, and most contemporary 10-inch stuff is going to be on the LP 3500 mono sequence. But this is the 2501 mono, a 10-inch sequence, 2501, 2510, both Howard Rumsey stuff. And people sleep on Howard Rumsey. I mean, it's a who's who of West Coast talent. And they had those cool Lighthouse label contemporary logos, which you don't see much in the 12-inch LP sequence. But like, it's a who's who of players. Russ Freeman, Howard Rumsey on the bass, Jimmy Joffrey, Bob Cooper, Milt Bernhardt, Shelly Mann. I mean, and the lineup, it's almost like Blakey's band, where Rumsey just has a who's who of talent from that time frame coming through the Howard Rumsey All-Stars, playing at the Lighthouse and Hermosa Beach. Bob Cooper, Bud Shank, Max Roach, and Claude Williamson. I mean, like, this is not New Orleans, Dixieland, traditional Southern. This is real modern jazz at its fieriest and up-tempoed, and it's as close to hard bop as the West Coast scene really gets. And there's plenty of that in the West Coast scene, though, at that time. The Bethlehem stuff, some of the Capitol 6500 series stuff. I mean, there's a lot of really hard driving. And even some of that stuff we talked about on Capitol, and even some of the stuff on RCA and Decca, some of those young kids were really pushing the envelope. And again, it's important to remember how important and impactful Jerry Mulligan and The Birth of the Cool with Miles Davis. You know, I mean, that's Jerry Mulligan more than it's a Miles Davis record. And Mulligan always resented not being properly dedicated on that by Capitol. And by the time The Birth of the Cool, as we know it, comes out, Miles Davis' star had risen quite a lot. And so he got so much of the credit. And really, it was a pretty huge team effort by a lot of people that Mulligan was spearheading. Lee Konitz was a big part of it. Gil Evans was a part of it. A lot of it was shaped in his apartment in New York. And, I mean, Miles was certainly a part of this whole confluence. But for a guy like Mulligan to carry some resentment for years about it, I think it speaks loud and clear that he deserves more credit than he gets. And Birth of the Cool is a real harbinger. It's a real echoing of what's to come. I mean, it's a predictive force. And it starts adding those European chords and those compositional sounds and those arranged pieces, and they throw the jazz improvisation in with it. And it's really an interesting splice that I think impacts so many listeners today and broadens what we think of as being the purest of jazz, when that definitely is a cross hybrid. You know, Birth of the Cool, a lot of that orchestral stuff. You start adding tubas and French horns and having them play chordal notes and angles. It's just, I mean, Ellington does some of that same stuff, but it's different with this Birth of the Cool sound. It has more of the medieval European sounds and traditions, it feels like, and it just changes and it swings a little less and feels a little bit more composed. But that's not to say Mulligan isn't brilliant, and Birth of the Cool is a fun listen. But it just sounds blues in a lot of ways. Blues are so loose. Blues is so open. Blues is so unpredictable. In spite of the simplicity, you never know what's going to come out of the mouth. I mean, it's a free form. It's just like, blah, that's what happened to this time. Feel that. I mean, I didn't know that was coming neither, but boo, that came out. And when you get more compositionally driven, the focus and the tones and the sounds are more precise and concise. And it allows for less expression in some ways. And that diminishes its jazz percentages. Because jazz is rooted in that free form of improvisation and emoting the context of my daily experience. And I don't want to be fettered by the hindrance of too much composition. And again, it's something I keep wanting to drive home, because I think it's a very important lesson to learn. The purest jazz is just so gospel, and Eddie Lockjaw Davis, that's as black as the music can be. Shirley Scott. There's tambourines. Bassy. That's the essence of jazz. It's swing. It's pattern. It's the roots of rhythm and blues. It's having open spaces and allowing the feel and the inflection. And if I got to put a woo up in there, I'll throw that in there. And I could be a trumpet player going woo, but if I feel the gospel, I'm going to let you know. But composition is more restrained. And there's a little bit less room for my woos because we're a bit more now in a Lutheran congregation. The Anglicans and the Presbyterians were having a meeting, and the piosity must remain at the highest of level. Amen. Ain't a potato salad there. You could take the black church and the white church, and in a lot of ways, the black church is celebrating, and it's just improvising even on top of their spirituals. It's very open and loose. But the amazing grace, the traditional white church experience is much more composed, much more restrained and refrained, much more what's written on the page. And it's not as open and as welcome for someone just to throw a bass guitar, tambourine, and somehow, once you get all that going, you're getting off script. So how much unscripted do you need to be or you want to be? And as a listener, I think it's important that we open our ears up and recognize that sometimes when it's just that loose, open celebration of the blues and the black church and the feelings of jazz and the improvisation, there's nothing freer. There's nothing more liberating. There's nothing more rewarding. Once you get it, it's like, ooh, that's a hoedown. They're having a good time. They're finding spiritual freedom. They're finding relaxation. They're finding an escape. And thinking about complex chord changes isn't part of my process having a good time. That's more like work. So let me just get back to throwing it down. Because I don't want to be too much thinking right now. I just want to be feeling, releasing, vibing, somewhat grooving. And let's not fool ourselves. The church and sexuality, those rivers flow real close. And they certainly intermingle at times. Those waters mix. And there's times you don't know which one I'm singing to. Am I secular or am I spiritual? That line's blurred. Blurred. But that's part of the magic. That's part of the power. That freedom to just get it off my chest. And so, the Howard Rumsey Lighthouse All-Stars are a wonderful confluence. And while there is some elements of that West Coast compositional, it's far more open and loose and driving and getting towards hard bop even. Some of these records are just, these cats get it. They just get what the black music was doing and are reinterpreting it with all the fury that they're capable of. And so again, really a group that's slept on by modern day collectors, and people even love contemporary records and skip over Howard Rumsey. I'm like, Max Roach. It's a who's who. If you look at the list of people who played with the Howard Rumsey All-Stars at the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach, it's a pretty impressive list. It's a really impressive list. And it's black and white players. So the brothers came out there and said, you know what, this, yeah, I'll sit in with this for a few weeks, a few months. Outstanding outfit. And Howard Rumsey was a great bass player and a real fantastic leader of a scene and a sound. And Contemporary did a great job focusing a lot of their early discography on Howard Rumsey and the Lighthouse All-Stars. There's got to be at least 5 or 6 10 inches, and then that gets coupled into the LP era, and there's more stuff in the LP era. There's a lot of Rumsey stuff on the early Contemporary chopping block, and it kind of gets slept on. You can go out and get that stuff for 10, 15, 20 bucks, 30 for nice copies. You shouldn't pay 30 bucks ever or more for those records because they're out there. Then they sold pretty well. And I guess one thing else I'm going to touch on real quick is I'm working on my Capitol catalog. I'm going to do my episode on Capitol probably next. I've gotten most of the things in the mail that I wanted to get that I was kind of waiting for. And it's just astounding. And something really lost on us. It's just astounding how small the modern reissue canon is versus the full body of work that was happening in the 50s and 60s. And the artists that we remember and accentuate and put importance on, and most of the time rightfully so, are but such a small portion of what was overwhelming the music industry. In the 50s, there was so much jazz being made on so many labels. And just Capitol alone, I mean, I've picked up probably about 50 Capitols in the last month, just because I wanted to do a good presentation on what these labels were doing. And you saw what Decca was doing. You saw what RCA was doing. You saw how they both had affiliation labels that had a little bit more progressive stuff in some cases. And what Capitol's doing is equally, just records that sold a lot of copies. And so many of these guys were very successful and had great careers and have become almost anonymous today. And so much of the most popular, greatest jazz of that time, the poll-winning jazz of that time, is in dollar bins and $2 bins. And we don't know the names. We've forgotten who the players were. We forgot what bands those guys played in. The pedigrees have been lost and forgotten because all we've been hearing about is the same few players. Miles, Monk, Coltrane, Parker sometimes. I mean, and rightfully so. These guys are the architects. But it's just incredible how much of the jazz canon is lost. Forgotten. And how much good playing is out there by what, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call the white imitators. I mean, and to give some context here, imagine we have a new format coming out tomorrow. Or even from the CD era into the digital era, or even from the LP era into the CD era. Just to give you some context, there's a format change that's going to be pushed on the public. And these labels have to figure out what music they're going to issue from their back catalogs and what they're going to promote on their new platform. And it'd be a bit like a hip-hop label putting out some new white hip-hop that's pretty progressive, cutting edge, and then it wants to put out a black hip-hop artist. So it's going back to something like the Fugees, or maybe Paid in Full, Eric B. and Rakim. I mean, it's going back to something that's kind of safe and homogenized at this point. Even Snoop Dogg, Doggy Style, as gangster as that was in 92, 93, that record is cartoon-like now, and it's so good. It's P-Funk, George Clinton fun, and as much of a party record as any Parliament record ever was. Doggy Style is a fun record. In spite of its kind of crudeness and our politically correct world, we don't really want to hear that kind of language today. Fuck y'all, it's a great record. It's fun, it's loose, it's free, and it's G-Funk, baby, P-Funk. It's right there. But it's like these labels issued stuff from the black side of the fence that was old and kind of, I mean, you see what I'm saying? And maybe they'd even have a LL Cool J and sign him and have him put out some new material because LL's still kind of safe, and I mean, he's been on, or Ice-T. Let's give Ice-T a contract, have him put out a few records because he's old news. He's been on TV for a long time. Like, white Americans comfortable with him now. But we're not going to sign any new cutting-edge black music. We'll sign the white guys who are doing that, and we'll sign the black cats from back in the day, but the new cutting-edge black stuff that kind of makes people uncomfortable, we're not going to touch that. And so like when Columbia does those Jazz Messenger records, it is quite outstanding. It is quite remarkable that they were willing to, and Miles kind of probably opens that door in some ways, but that Jazz Messenger record with Horace Silver and Donald Byrd and Hank Mobley, I mean, that's a serious record. Doug Watkins is on the bass, Blakey's on the drums, and those two records that they do on Columbia in 56, 57, that's good stuff. That's really good stuff. And 55, 56 actually, that's what they were. That's incredible stuff that Columbia's, that's modern, inventive, powerful, progressive, political, cultural, socially conscious hip hop, jazz. That's what that Messenger stuff was at Columbia. So yeah, we'll put that out. And it sticks out like a sore thumb in what's happening in the rest of the major labels. And it's kind of across the board. All four of these labels, man, they all took that same formula. We'll take pretty progressive white stuff. You know what I mean? Jimmy Joffrey, sure. We'll take a chance on that. I mean, but it's all very predicated on the American marketplace and the American consumer and what these people are going to feel comfortable looking at in their grocery stores and drug stores. And, I mean, wherever records were sold in the 1950s. Your Woolworths and your Five and Dimes and your Sears. It was, and it's also shocking just how rare and obscure Blue Note, Riverside, Savoy, Prestige, I mean, Argo, some of those real jazz titles, the real black jazz titles especially, how rare some of those things are and how many of them still exist is amazing. For some of those records that have sold 5,000, 6,000 copies, 2,000, 3,000 copies, for there to be any left 7 years later, it's pretty nuts. And there's actually quite a few left. And it says something about jazz collectors, first of all. You know, they take pretty good care of their stuff. And Blue Note, it's hard to represent how rare Blue Notes are because there's been so many reissue programs throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000s. Blue Notes kind of always had a bit of a cachet, bigger than when they were releasing that stuff. You know, they probably press as many copies now of a Blue Note reissue title and sell as many now as they did when those records came out initially. I bet you they sell 2,000 copies of some new Blue Note title easily, and that was probably pretty tough for some of the more obscure titles that Blue Note did back in 55, 56, 57. So it's just really, it's never been clearer to me how niche and small a lot of the black jazz labels are and were, and how broad and how many copies of the mass-produced mainstream jazz replica stuff, how much of that's out there, and how cheap most of it is. You can get some pretty good stuff with great covers and titles for $2, $3, $4, $5, which is pretty cool. And if you want to lump them together, you can get them for like $1 a piece, some of that sometimes. So I'm going to leave it at that. We'll come up with that Capital episode real soon. I'm going to go put some shit in my eye. Appreciate you all. If you want to subscribe to the channel, it's always appreciated. Share it with your friends who like music. You know, we talk about a lot of interesting stuff on this channel. Those who want to support the channel, please go to my Patreon and pledge a few bucks a month. That's always very appreciated and valued. You all have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.